The fire took only 6 minutes. That's what the town record claims, though the ashes told a different story. St. Caledonia's chapel had stood on the ridge for 81 years, a crooked stone structure with black windows and a copper bell that never quite rang right. On February the 3rd, 1904, the choir had gathered early for the Ash Wednesday rehearsal. 12 children, all under the age of 13, and their choir master, Father Ellis Bram. At 5:41 p.m., a passerby saw smoke twisting from the chapel roof. By 5:44, flames were leaping from the windows. By 5:47, the entire chapel had collapsed. No survivors, or so they said. What remained was a blistered stone foundation and an eerie silence over the ridge that would never lift. But that night, several townspeople reported hearing singing, soft, high, and echoing from the blackened hilltop long after the fire had eaten every living thing inside. The mayor blamed it on grief. The townsfolk whispered it was the choir, still rehearsing. Local newspaper editor Josiah Green documented the event in chilling detail. He published sketches of melted hymnals, warped metal organ pipes, and rows of children's shoes lined up near the altar, untouched by fire, as if placed after the collapse. He also recorded something the sheriff refused to print, a statement from a school teacher who lived across the valley. Miss Alma Riggs swore she heard the old chapel bell ring at exactly 3:17 a.m. that night. She wasn't the only one. 3 other families reported the same, yet the bell had been recovered from the wreckage, split down the middle like a cracked egg. It had no clapper, no possibility of sound, and yet it rang. Within days, St. Caledonia's ruins became sacred and forbidden ground. Children dared one another to run through it. None ever did. Animals wouldn't graze near it. The town elders tried to clear the land and erect a memorial. But every crew hired quit within hours. They said the soil hummed, that if you stood still, you could hear a voice whispering, always just behind you, and that one by one, the names of the choir children would rise in your mind, even if you'd never known them. This terrified the workers most of all. They said the names didn't come like memories. They came like prayers. The town, once proud of its religious heart, grew ashamed of what remained on the hill. Ministers stopped speaking of the fire. Families forbade mention of the choir. By summer, the church was gone from maps. But one thing could not be forgotten. On the eve of every Ash Wednesday, no matter the weather, faint voices could still be heard on the ridge, singing in harmony. A song no one recognized, in a language no one could name. It was not Latin, not English, and not dead. The first to challenge the silence was a railway inspector named Otis Harland, hired to survey a new line that would cut through the hills north of St. Caledonia's ruins. Harland was a practical man with no tolerance for superstition. He set up his camp a quarter-mile from the chapel's remains, scribbled his measurements by lantern light, and laughed off the locals' warnings. But when he failed to report for 3 consecutive days, the company sent men to retrieve him. What they found was unnerving. His tent had collapsed inward, his equipment untouched, and Harland himself was crouched inside the chapel's ruin, facing the hollow altar, humming quietly to himself. When spoken to, he didn't flinch. When touched, he screamed. The same tune repeated under his breath, over and over, the same strange language. No one could break him from it. He died in a sanitarium 7 months later, still humming. That same summer, the mayor commissioned a soil analysis of the burned site, suspecting arsenic or mercury contamination was behind the town's growing unease. A team from Charleston arrived with instruments and samples, and for 2 days all was quiet. On the 3rd day, their lead geologist, Dr. Fenwick, buried a sealed vial of earth beneath a cedar tree, then instructed his assistants never to retrieve it. "There's something wrong in the humus," he wrote in his field notes. "It responds to memory." Fenwick refused to elaborate and demanded their findings not be published. His silence would later cost him his career, but when questioned in court, he would only offer one chilling sentence: "The children are not gone, just misplaced." By October, reports multiplied. A widowed farmer claimed to see faces in the blackened windows of the chapel's husk, faces that glowed and wept without moving. A travelling merchant heard footsteps behind him on the path beside the ridge, though he walked it alone. More troubling were the letters that began to arrive in town, postmarked from other states, letters written in childlike scrawl, signed with the names of the choir children. They said things like, "We are still learning," and "The voice is getting louder." The postmaster initially dismissed it as a cruel joke, until one envelope arrived addressed to him directly, bearing his deceased daughter's handwriting. She had been one of the 12. The town's denial slowly curdled into dread. St. Caledonia's bell was buried in an unmarked plot, but dogs would whimper and paw at the ground above it. A single daisy bloomed on the grave every year on February 3rd, always white, always alone. No one ever saw it grow. Children born in the town after the fire refused to sing. Not one schoolhouse had a music lesson that lasted longer than a week, and the choir lofts in every church, for reasons one could explain, grew cold. Whatever had been lost in that 6-minute fire had not been extinguished. It had only been made invisible, and it was waiting, tuning itself for something far worse. By winter of 1904, the land surrounding St. Caledonia's chapel had become a boundary no one crossed without reason. Even the deer, it was said, stopped at the clearing's edge and turned back. But a child named Marla Penrose did not. She was 6, with a pale ribbon always knotted around her wrist, and a fascination with the music place, as she called it. Her mother, Ruth, let her play by the tree line, but forbade her from going farther. One evening, just as the sun slid behind the ridge, Marla disappeared. No tracks, no cries, no broken branches, but hours later, her ribbon floated back to the porch, damp, curled in on itself and humming. When searchers entered the chapel grounds, they found no sign of her. But what they did find chilled them more. A crude arrangement of bones on the altar, not human, but arranged in the exact form of a treble clef, a pattern that only the music teacher from St. Caledonia recognized. "It's the first note of the requiem they never finished," he whispered, face drained. The choir, in their last practice before the fire, had begun a choral mass in Latin, one designed to be sung for the dead, but they'd never completed it. That first note was the only one performed, and now it had returned in bone. Rumors began to circulate that the fire itself hadn't been accidental. There were whispers of an unauthorized ritual, something the children had been taught by an outsider who appeared weeks before the tragedy, a man with a soft voice and no known name, who had claimed to be a musicologist of ancient tongues. No records placed him in town, no lodger's book, no rail ticket, but several students had mentioned the man in the violet coat in their final diary entries, recovered from waterlogged trunks after the fire. He had spoken of vibrations that revealed truth, of songs that could shape memory. One entry simply read, "He says we must sing before it's too late." The oldest townsfolk remembered other fires, one in 1841, another in 1816, both linked to church choirs, both unsolved. But those stories had been buried, choked beneath layers of shame and rewritten town records. It wasn't until a local school teacher, Ms. Ada Crick, unearthed an old ledger in the library's attic that connections surfaced. The ledger held a crude map, showing circles drawn around each former choir fire site. At the center was a symbol no one could identify, 3 interlocking mouths, each open, each facing a different direction. Beneath it, a phrase in Latin, Vox Invicta, the unconquered voice. From that day, Ada's hands began to tremble whenever she passed a church bell. Her handwriting deteriorated, letters skipping and curling into ancient shapes. She claimed to hear the children at night, not screaming, but singing. Always the same melody, always incomplete. The town tried to forget again, but this time the melody wouldn't let them. It seeped into floorboards, into the cracks between Sunday prayers. Something had been summoned in 1904, and it was still looking for a stage. After Marla's ribbon was found, humming faintly against the porch wood, the town reached a fevered pitch of dread. Sheriff Conrad Blake led a second, larger search into the overgrown remains of St. Caledonia's grounds. The searchers carried lanterns, hymnals, and revolvers, blessings in one hand, bullets in the other. They combed the ruins, but the grass grew unnatural there, thick and metallic in hue like scorched copper. What remained of the chapel bell had sunken into the earth, its mouth tilted skyward like it was still trying to cry out. But the strangest thing was what they heard. Not birds, not wind, but the distinct sound of children's voices rehearsing scales, soft, distant, and impossible. One man, Morris Calhoun, an ex-deacon turned drunk, ventured farther than the rest. He claimed he saw children standing in a semicircle deep in the woods, faces blurred like fog on glass. They were swaying, mouths open, not blinking. Behind them stood a tall figure, arms stretched wide, conducting nothing. Morris dropped his lantern and ran, but not before one of the children turned and looked at him. Only it had no eyes, just dark pits that echoed with sound. The next day, Morris was found wandering the edge of the river, shirtless, muttering a Latin phrase over and over. Non auditum, sed visum. Not heard, but seen. The town doctor attributed it to sunstroke and whiskey. But Morris never drank again. He stopped speaking entirely after that, save for humming a 5-note tune each dusk, just before the sun dipped below the hills. His wife said it made the wallpaper peel. Back at the schoolhouse, Ms. Ada Crick began to compile every reference she could find to St. Caledonia's choir and the pattern of fires stretching back nearly a century. She noted that each fire occurred precisely 63 years apart, always in July, always on a Tuesday, and always at the hour of Compline, the monastic prayer for the end of day. In each case, a children's choir had been rehearsing as she brought her findings to the town council, but they dismissed her as a superstitious old maid. One man even laughed and said, "Choirs don't cause fires, Ada." But as he rose to leave the meeting, the lights flickered and a low hum rattled the floorboards. Every clock in the building stopped at 9:13 p.m. That night, his barn caught fire. Nothing else. Just the barn. Inside were burned sheets of music paper. No animals, no tools, just ashes shaped like a conductor's wand and notes smeared into soot on the walls. The town had no explanation. It held its breath. And across the ridge, in the long-dead sanctuary of St. Caledonia, the wind passed through the empty window frames like breath through a throat. The melody returned, unfinished, unclaimed, and growing bolder. The townspeople tried to move on, to close the book on what had happened atop the hill where St. Caledonia once stood. But something was seeping into their daily lives, silent yet impossible to ignore. Children began waking up in the middle of the night, crying about voices under the floor or singing from the trees. A boy named Elijah Stowe was found sleepwalking near the charred ruins, with soot covering his hands and an antique brass pitch pipe clenched between his teeth. His parents claimed they didn't own such an object. When the town physician inspected it, he discovered it was engraved with a date, July 9th, 1841, exactly 63 years before the fire that destroyed the choir. Some began whispering that it wasn't a fire that consumed the chapel, but something older, something summoned. They spoke of the dissonant, an ancient presence bound in melody and blood. It was said to thrive on unfinished harmonies and children's voices, appearing only when a choir broke its vow of silence. A hymn sung out of order, a note struck in rebellion, a harmony fractured by disobedience. Each mistake fed it. Each innocent voice became its echo. Pastor Thaddeus Gray, a newcomer to Bell Hollow, tried to rally the town with prayer. He organized a community hymn circle near the remnants of the schoolhouse to retake sacred ground. Over 50 families attended. As they sang, it began to rain. At first, gently, then violently. But the strangest part wasn't the storm. It was the way the hymn shifted mid-verse, as if guided by unseen hands. Voices began to warp. Children faltered. Old women fainted. Pastor Gray fell to his knees and vomited black bile as the congregation collapsed into stunned silence. Afterward, many who'd been present claimed they didn't remember what song they were singing. Others remembered too well and refused to repeat the tune, claiming it brought dreams of burnt pews, mouthless children, and a bell suspended above a hole that led nowhere. One man took a horse out of town that very night and never returned. Another carved musical staves into his living room walls and claimed they had to be finished before the return. Ms. Crick, who had been documenting every occurrence with obsessive precision, finally confessed to Reverend Billings that she had received letters, unsigned, dated decades ago, warning of a reckoning in 1904 tied to the choir's defiance. She brought them to him in a satchel soaked from the rain. The parchment felt wrong, thick like skin, and the ink shimmered crimson in candlelight. One phrase repeated in each. The song was never theirs to sing. The Reverend urged her to burn the documents, but she refused. Instead, she buried them beneath the floorboards of the schoolhouse. When the tremors began, they were almost imperceptible, felt only by those who lived closest to the chapel's ruins. A slight shake in the floorboards, a cup rattling on a shelf, the sensation of distant, hollow drumming beneath the earth. Some believed it to be the lingering damage from the fire. Others said it was the hill itself, mourning. But the tremors grew more insistent each night, aligning with something few noticed at first, the exact time the choir had burned. 9:16 p.m. In the Bell Hollow General Store, clocks began to fail at that same hour, their hands frozen or spinning backward. Candles snuffed themselves. One woman claimed her phonograph turned on by itself and played an unfamiliar hymn, a discordant minor key lullaby that made her baby scream in terror. She threw the machine into the creek the next morning, but she still heard the melody in her walls. Back at the schoolhouse, the children's behavior changed. Those who survived the fire, and even those who hadn't been part of the choir, started scribbling musical notations in their notebooks. None of them remembered doing it. The markings followed no known key or scale. A local music teacher, Mrs. Ellensworth, tried to transcribe the symbols, but after a few bars, she stopped cold and muttered, "This isn't written for the living." She left town days later, abandoning her home and never writing again. The gravedigger, Amos Tripp, who had always been regarded as slightly touched, began speaking of voices underground. He said the coffins beneath St. Caledonia had been disturbed, not from above, but from within. He swore he heard a rehearsal, muffled beneath the cemetery soil, each night just before 9:16. At first, people laughed him off, but when 4 separate grave plots were found ruptured from below, the laughter died. One of the town's midwives, a rational woman by all accounts, reported that a no, born she delivered spoke, sang upon birth. Just a single note, a high, piercing tone. The baby never cried again and passed away within a week. The midwife abandoned her practice and moved to the next county, refusing to attend any more births in Bell Hollow. Then came the black snow. It fell only around the chapel's footprint, even when the skies above were clear. The flakes were light but oily, clinging to windows and wagons. A child touched one and went mute for 2 days, only to speak again in verses that sounded like lyrics, unfinished ones. Ms. Crick tried collecting the flakes for study, but they melted not into water but into soot. A sense of anticipation was spreading, like the intake of breath before a note is sung. The town was becoming an instrument. Streets resonated. The wind through the trees sounded suspiciously tuned, and no one dared walk past the chapel hill after dusk, not because of what could be seen, but because of what they feared they might hear. And in every home, every barn, every cellar, someone, somewhere, reported hearing footsteps in perfect time, as if a procession had begun, one with no visible participants, yet always keeping rhythm. The night of October the 3rd marked the first true. At precisely 9:16 p.m., the air shifted. From the ashes of the chapel hill, a single note rang out, not from any bell, not from any known instrument, but from the earth itself. A G-sharp, drawn long, impossibly pure. It echoed for 12 full seconds before dissipating into a silence deeper than silence. In the homes nearest to the ruin, children began humming in their sleep. Each one hummed the same droning melody, one they had never been taught. Parents shook them awake, but the humming continued even as their eyes opened, vacant and unblinking. In one case, the child's lips never moved at all. The sound came from her throat, as if something were using her as a vessel. Mrs. Whitley, the town's former piano teacher, had been half-mad since the fire. But that night, she stood in the center of Bell Hollow's empty bandstand and conducted an invisible orchestra, waving her arms in wild arcs as if she were keeping time for a symphony only she could hear. Witnesses say her face was radiant, glowing from within. At the crescendo, she collapsed with a smile frozen on her face and never woke again. That same evening, the mayor's office received a telegraph from Charleston, strange enough in itself, as the wires had been dead since the storm weeks earlier. The message contained only a single line: "The cantata was never finished. It will finish itself." There was no record of who sent it, no source, just static afterward. Inside the town library, the hymnals began to disappear. Not stolen, vanished. Pages gone mid-sentence. Blank gaps where lyrics used to be. In one case, a child opened a hymnal and screamed. The paper inside was wet and warm, the ink moving like black veins beneath flesh. Those who tried to leave town that week found their paths redirected. Roads they had traveled for decades turned unfamiliar. One farmer said he walked north for 6 hours and ended up back. At the base of the chapel hill, boots soaked in soot, hands trembling, eyes bloodshot. Even the animals knew. The dogs howled each night, precisely 3 minutes before the note returned. The horses refused to move toward the hill, and the crows, the ones that had fled after the fire, returned in droves, circling the ruins in a perfect spiral formation, as if waiting for a conductor's downbeat. Bell Hollow was no longer just haunted. It was resonating, preparing for a final movement, and those who stayed were beginning to understand they weren't being haunted by ghosts. They were being tuned. They found the first body buried beneath the remains of the choir loft. A young girl, no older than 14, her limbs twisted unnaturally, but her face perfectly serene. What was most disturbing wasn't her presence, but the impossible condition of the space around her. The wood that had collapsed during the fire was unburned, untouched by soot, as though something had... Reverend Mallory ordered the excavation stopped immediately, but it was too late. The disturbance had triggered something. That night, 3 more families in Bell Hollow awoke to find their children missing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, just opened windows, cold drafts and hymnals left open on the kitchen tables, all opened to the same song. "He who endures the flame shall rise," a hymn never recorded in any of the town's archives. The townspeople began to gather each evening near the hill, unable to explain why, not out of fear or curiosity, but compulsion. Something called them there, softly but insistently, like the smell of smoke before you see the fire. One woman brought her infant, another dragged an old piano bench, claiming she felt she was meant to sit again. And when the sun dipped below the ridgeline, they stood together in a strange stillness, heads tilted upward, mouths open, not singing, but listening, waiting for something they did not understand, but already feared. By the end of that week, the sound had returned, not the lone note, but a chorus, not loud, not angry, lush, layered, voices without bodies harmonizing above the ruins in perfect intervals. It was music not made by hands or mouths, but something deeper, stranger, the kind of music that might be used not to worship God, but to build something. And then came the man in the black coat. No one recognized him, no one remembered seeing him arrive. He stood at the chapel ruins with a thick, leather-bound book under his arm and eyes like burnt coal. When asked who he was, he simply smiled and said, "I've come to collect the notes that never died." Bell Hollow had forgotten its own history, but something ancient hadn't. The music had returned not as memory, but as payment. The man in the black coat didn't speak much. He didn't need to. People moved around him like sleepwalkers, unquestioning, unnerved, but compliant. He took up residence in the church's charred remains, laying out delicate pages of music across the pews as though preparing for a service that hadn't been held in over a decade. No one dared ask where the pages came from, yet every day new ones appeared, handwritten, yellowed, and inked with notes in a scale that no one could quite decipher. The townspeople began calling him the choir master, though he never confirmed or denied the name. He did not advertise his presence. He simply was, like the smell of ash that never left the town's breath. He never invited anyone in, but soon they began coming on their own. Widows, drunks, former school teachers, all drawn back to the site like moths to a hymn they didn't know they remembered. And when they entered the ruins, something strange happened. Their lips moved, singing melodies they could not name, harmonies they couldn't read, music they hadn't learned but had always known. The choirmaster watched them silently, correcting nothing, encouraging nothing, as though the notes themselves had preordained the singers long before the fire ever began. Outside the church, Bell Hollow was unraveling. Crops began to rot from the inside out. The river turned viscous and dark, and the fish floated belly up without a sound. Horses bucked in the children sang in their sleep now, full choruses, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in tongues that predated Latin altogether, and the sound grew louder, more precise, more purposeful. Several began drawing intricate symbols on the walls with ash and soot, geometries not of religion, but of resonance. Something ancient and vibratory, something designed not to praise, but to summon. On the 7th night of the choirmaster's arrival, the entire hill where the church once stood breathed. Witnesses claimed the ground itself rose and fell with a low, resonant hum. Dogs refused to go near it. Birds stopped flying over it. The wind changed course to avoid it. And from beneath the earth, a soft thump began, like a heartbeat, measured, intentional, in rhythm with the melody the townspeople could no longer forget. Something had survived the fire, something that had waited patiently, beneath ash, beneath memory, beneath faith itself. And now it was being sung into form. Sheriff Elwood Travers, a man of hard jaw and iron routine, had been the last holdout against the church's reawakening. A staunch Baptist, he'd fought to keep the ruins roped off, declared them a hazard, even posted 2 young deputies to guard the perimeter. But by the 2nd week, both boys had quit. One had stopped speaking altogether, the other fled the county entirely. When Elwood demanded answers, the silent one simply pointed to his ears. He hadn't gone deaf. No. Far worse, he said he could now hear the choir even when there was no sound. The sheriff went up himself the next day, pistol at his hip and scripture in his coat pocket. Witnesses say he was gone for 4 hours. When he returned, his boots were missing, his hands were blackened with soot, and his eyes had gone glassy, like marbles set behind smoked glass. He didn't speak of what happened on the hill, not to anyone, but he stopped interfering. That. He even began attending the night gatherings, his thick voice humming low harmony beneath the spectral soprano of the children. Word spread beyond Bell Hollow, as such things do. A traveling photographer from Cincinnati came to document what the newspapers had dubbed the singing ashes. He took 3 glass plates before fleeing town. When he developed them, every image was the same. A perfect recreation of the church before it burned, right down to the choir boys in white cassocks, all perfectly visible, all staring at the camera, every single one eyeless. A Methodist preacher from Ohio tried to hold a rival revival a few hills over. He died in his sleep 3 nights later. Heart failure, they said, but his wife found him clutching a small page of music in his left hand, scored in crimson, not ink, and the notes on it matched the melody sung by the Bell Hollow Choir. By now, the gatherings were nightly. Always at dusk, always beneath the ribs of that burned church, with no roof above to mute the stars. Candles were forbidden. Light disrupted the sound. They sang in darkness, guided by pitch, drawn by memory. Not one of them remembered learning the songs. Yet each one knew when to begin, when to stop, when to modulate. The choirmaster, now more apparition than man, stood motionless as ever. He no longer held sheets. He no longer moved at all. Some said he wasn't breathing. Others claimed he never had. And then came the 11th night. No one sang, not one note. By morning, the entire town seemed quieter, like the air itself had thickened into wool. No birds called, no dogs barked, not even the wind stirred through the burned remains of the chapel's bones. Bell Hollow had always been a place where sound carried, hammers, hooves, hymnals, but now even the blacksmith's anvil felt muffled, as if some invisible veil had descended over everything, muting the world beneath a sacred hush. The children who had sung the night before awoke changed. Some had no memory of even attending the gathering. Others spoke in voices too calm, too measured, describing things they couldn't possibly know. Verses from ancient psalms never taught in America, the names of fallen angels, dates of past revivals that ended in blood. One boy, Samuel Dietrich, only 6 years old, was found seated in the churchyard, eyes wide and dry, humming an overture that was later identified by a visiting music scholar as a forgotten composition by Giovanni Battista Pergolesi. The boy had never left Bell Hollow in his life. Parents began locking their doors at dusk. Some fled outright. But those who stayed noticed something even more chilling. Those who resisted the gatherings began aging faster. Wrinkles appeared overnight. Teeth yellowed, hands trembled. It was as if the choir demanded not just attendance but submission. The town's oldest widow, Miss Letty Crane, tried to burn the remaining hymnals she'd stored in her attic. That night, her chimney collapsed inward, crushing her in her bed. Her mouth was open. Her tongue had been split down the middle. Reverend Mallory, desperate for divine clarity, journeyed alone up the mountain to fast and pray at the ruins. He returned 3 days later, skin blistered and eyes clouded white. He didn't speak, but he carried a crude symbol scrawled in ash on a torn strip of cloth, an open mouth surrounded by 13 flames. Later, though, at week it appeared carved into every doorframe on Chapel Street. The choirmaster never spoke again, not in song, not in word, but his presence deepened. Those who saw him closely claimed his robes were not cloth, but soot held together by some magnetic force, and where his shadow touched the ground, moss blackened and grass never grew again. That night the children sang without being summoned. No one called them, no bell was rung, but as twilight fell, every boy and girl walked in silence toward the black ribs of the church. No shoes, no coats, just their breath in the cold and voices too pure for this world. What they sang was no hymn. It was a lament. And it wasn't for the dead. It was for us, the living. Because something had now been promised, and like all holy debts, it demanded payment. It was the third night when the bell rang again. Only no bell remained in Bell Hollow. The old brass chime that had crowned the chapel was reduced to molten metal in the fire, a warped heap beside the altar's charred stone. Yet at precisely midnight, the sound was unmistakable. One toll, deep and resonant, echoing through the hills like the groan of an iron heart. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once. And as it faded, every dog in town began to howl, except the ones that had been seen near the choir. Those remained silent, paralyzed in place, as if awaiting some command. Sheriff Amos Putney, who had spent the last few days denying rumors and assuring townsfolk of natural explanations, was found sitting in the cemetery. His notebook lay open in his lap, soaked from the frost. He was committed to the sanatorium in Wheeling the next morning. He never spoke again, only mimed, conducting an invisible orchestra each time a clock struck 12. The townspeople began to fear their children, not in the way frightened parents fear misbehavior, but in the way ancient tribes feared eclipses, comets, and darkened skies. The young ones no longer responded to their names. Their eyes tracked unseen things. They wept when the sun rose. One mother, frantic, slapped her daughter's face to break her trance, only to fall to her knees in horror as her child bled black from the nose, her eyes still locked on something behind the woman, something neither of them dared name. The choirmaster appeared again that week, not within the church but in the mirror of the general store, where old Mr. Henley was shaving before opening his shop. The reflection behind him didn't match the room. No windows, no shelves, only dark red walls, and the faint shape of a man floating just above the ground. Mr. Henley suffered a stroke moments later. When the townsfolk found him, every mirror in the building had shattered inward. It was around then that people noticed the smoke again, thin grey columns rising from the ruins of the chapel even when no fire burned. The scent was strange, neither wood nor flesh, but old paper and myrrh. The children were seen gathering at the edge of the rubble, kneeling, chanting, their breath visible in the warm summer air. The few who still dared attend Sunday services in the makeshift chapel began to report visions, flashes of children in old-world garments, choirs assembled in stone cathedrals lit by blood-colored glass, sermons spoken in no human tongue. One woman vomited pages from an unfamiliar hymnal. They were dry, curled, and already aged. Then the bells rang again. This time, 12 times. A warning, or perhaps a countdown. By the end of June, it was no longer possible to keep the town from fracturing. Bell Hollow's once orderly calm had curdled into a paranoia that bled through every conversation, every locked door, every unspoken glance toward the chapel's ruin. What began as whispers of resurrection had turned into louder, more dangerous talk, of possession, of curses, of divine punishment. The town council attempted to hold a meeting at the schoolhouse to reassure the public, but only 5 citizens showed up. All 5 had burns across their palms, self-inflicted, it seemed, from pressing their hands against the chapel's scorched stones. One woman, Mrs. Langley, a respected elder, spoke in a voice not her own. Deep and cavernous, with a European accent no one could place, she chanted an unbroken verse for 17 minutes straight. Her throat did not dry, her eyes did not blink. When she finished, she collapsed, and her mouth bled in the shape of a cross. The old hymnal, presumed lost in the fire, reappeared in the library, not on a shelf, but in the locked display case that once held the town's founding documents. It wasn't the same book, precisely. The leather binding bore no title. The pages had no notes, only sigils burned into the paper as if branded from the inside. Whoever tried to read it reported hearing faint choirs behind them, though no one ever stood there. That week, the grave of Esther Morgan was found disturbed. Her coffin, exhumed by some unknown force, lay open beneath the stars, but her body had not decayed. The black-robed figure began appearing outside windows, always silent, always watching. Children called him the choir master, but adults refused to speak his name. It was said if you acknowledged him out loud, he would step closer each night, 1 inch at a time, until your reflection didn't match your body anymore. The railroad tracks near the hollow warped. Trains refused to stop. Conductors reported seeing a thick mist at mile marker 12, the same number of children who had burned. One engineer swore he heard a girl's voice asking if he remembered the final note. He resigned the same evening and left town barefoot. All clocks in Bell Hollow stopped at 12:12. No matter how often they were wound, replaced, or reset, they ticked down to that time and then ceased. What happened at 12:12? No one could remember, but everyone felt it. Like the silence after a scream you don't realize you made, like the breath you forget to take before a fall, a moment that had already passed, but left a mark that grew darker each day. And deeper beneath the chapel's remains, something was beginning to hum. The humming beneath the ruined chapel wasn't mechanical, nor was it natural. It had no pitch, no rhythm, yet it resonated in the spine like a tuning fork driven into the soul. It grew louder only in the presence of silence, as if it fed on absence. Bell Hollow's people had started to fear quiet itself. Radios, phonographs, even the broken church bell were kept running, rung or spun without pause. But it was never enough. The moment sound died, the hum returned, and it came with visions. It began with the children, sleepless, jittery, drawing symbols in chalk on every surface, symbols that weren't in any known alphabet. Parents would scrub them off, only to find them reappeared carved into wood the next morning, burned into the kitchen tables, scrawled onto mirrors with soot. One child, Ruthie Beck, was found kneeling in the center of the old choir circle. She was blindfolded with ash-streaked gauze, her hands tied with strands of her own hair. She sang a single note for over 2 hours without pausing for breath. Her mother screamed for her to stop, but Ruthie didn't hear her. Not until a sharp crack echoed from the ground below. Then she simply collapsed, whispering, "It's almost time. He's almost whole." No one knew who he was, except perhaps the mayor's wife. Mrs. Fairmont had been silent for weeks, but now she began speaking again, in perfect Latin, despite never having studied it. The town doctor caught her one night, standing naked in front of her mirror, whispering to it in that same tongue. When he asked what she was doing, she replied, "He must have a body again. He must sing through flesh." Soon, the birds left Bell Hollow. Dogs refused to walk near the church ruins. The town's river began running backward, just an inch, just a trickle. But it was real, verified by engineers from out of town. They left by nightfall, shaken and refusing to discuss it. One of them later mailed a letter to a local teacher reading only, "The water sings under the stone. It remembers too much." That night, the teacher hung herself from the rafters of the schoolhouse. Written on the blackboard in her final lesson was one line, underlined 3 times. Their mouths were burned, but not their song. The new hymn book, the one found in the library case, now emitted a scent, burnt cedar and decayed lilies. Pages turned of their own accord. Those who tried to remove it found their fingertips blistered into shapes that resembled musical notes. One note repeated across multiple people, a minor, and always, always, the humming. It rose to a crescendo when the moon turned red. On that night, the graves behind the chapel cracked. No bodies emerged, but every tone marker wept a thick, dark sap that stained the ground in lines. When viewed from the bell tower, what was left of it, they formed the shape of a music staff, 12 lines, one for each child. By the second week of October, the air in Bell Hollow had changed, not colder, denser. Breathing became labored, as though invisible ash hung suspended in every breath. No birds had returned. The town's well began producing a thick, iron-smelling liquid that bubbled even when untouched. Some believed it to be blood. Others insisted it was the choir's last tears, fermented and fed upon by something still beneath the scorched chapel floor. The town council attempted to seal off the ruins entirely. They erected barriers, posted warnings, even hired men with rifles to guard the perimeter. But at dusk, the barriers always moved, rearranged themselves into strange angular shapes no one admitted to touching. The guards began quitting one by one, reporting whispers in their ears, the sound of children singing lullabies in reverse, and the sensation of being watched by eyes that didn't blink. One guard went missing entirely. They found only his boots, placed neatly at the threshold of the church ruins, filled to the brim with salt. Pastor Klein, driven nearly mad with guilt, began conducting services underground. Literally, he and a few remaining faithful cleared out the old mining tunnel below the parsonage and transformed it into a makeshift sanctuary. Candles, Bibles, a cross carved from a tree struck by lightning. He claimed this was the only place God would listen now. But those who attended said the shadows moved independently of the light, that during sermons they would feel cold hands gently press on their shoulders, and that occasionally someone would hum along. From a part of the tunnel no one had entered. Meanwhile, the children of Bell Hollow were no longer sleeping. They stared at walls for hours. They stopped eating bread but craved ash. Some of them developed matching scars on their backs, lines that curved like wings, burned in symmetrical patterns. Doctors wouldn't explain it, and the children would only say, "We were chosen to echo." One night, a young girl named Miriam was caught digging behind the chapel. When questioned, she said she was unburying the mouths. She held in her hands what appeared to be fragments of jawbone, child-sized, fused to rusted copper wire. Her fingernails were blackened, not with dirt, but ink, and beneath the dirt, the adults uncovered something else, a circular pattern of burnt floorboards, still warm to the touch, radiating outward like the grooves of a record. The townspeople tried to destroy it. Fire, acid, hammers, nothing worked. In fact, the more they tried, the more the wood seemed to grow. New boards appeared overnight, inscribed with Latin phrases no one could fully translate, but one line repeated, "The song shall rise when the faithful fall," and the faithful were falling fast. By All Hallows' Eve, the church bells, long melted, rang once more, not from above but from beneath the earth. 12 tones, 12 chimes. The town's clocks all stopped at that moment, frozen at 11:44 p.m., and outside, on the chapel hill, 12 shadows stood in a semicircle facing the ruin. None of them cast reflections, but all of them sang. After the bells rang from beneath the earth, the entire town of Bell Hollow descended into a state of quiet hysteria. No screams, no riots, just a paralyzing awareness that something irreversible had happened. It was as if the sound had carved open a new chamber inside every soul, and whatever had been hiding behind it now had permission to speak. Doors that had stayed shut for generations began creaking open without wind. Photographs warped. In some homes, portraits of family members would slowly turn to face the wall, as if ashamed to witness what was coming. Mayor Trumbull called for an emergency gathering the next morning. Only 13 residents showed up. Most wouldn't leave their homes. Others were missing. A few were found wandering the forest's edge barefoot, their hands bleeding from clutching something sharp that wasn't there. One man was found kneeling in the center of the schoolhouse, reciting verses from a hymnal that didn't exist, every verse in reverse, every page black with soot. The mayor, desperate and visibly shaken, pleaded with Pastor Klein for a solution. Klein offered a chilling proposal, a cleansing ritual older than the church itself, said to have been passed down from the region's first settlers, Scots-Irish missionaries who had fled persecution, only to meet something much darker in the West Virginia hollows. The ritual required 12 offerings, objects infused with the deepest grief, buried in a circle around the chapel's foundation. The 13th would be a voice, a song, not of praise, but of surrender. The town gave what it could: a widow's wedding ring, a scorched child's toy, a soldier's bloodied diary, a mother's braid cut from her corpse before burial, and at the center Miriam, the young girl who had unearthed the mouth bones, was chosen or volunteered. No one could remember clearly. She stood silently while Klein lit the black candles, his hands trembling, his Bible bound shut with barbed wire. The circle formed, the ritual began. But as Klein chanted the ancient verses, something went wrong. The wind died. The stars blinked out. And then the earth itself began to sing. Not a melody, but a low droning sound like a funeral procession humming beneath the soil. The offerings combusted, not with flame, but with silence. Total, swallowing silence. Miriam opened her mouth and began to sing, but no sound came out. Her shadow grew long behind her, stretching toward the ruin, and then it detached. And everyone watched, paralyzed, as her shadow walked ahead of her, entered the ruined chapel, and vanished. Then the song returned. 12 voices again, but warped, slowed, choking. They sang not to be heard, but to replace the sound of the living. The wind returned, but it howled in reverse. One man's eyes began to bleed, another collapsed and aged 30 years in minutes. Pastor Klein collapsed, clutching his chest. His last words: "They never left the fire, we only covered it." As the ritual circle cracked and the black candles melted into blood, the chapel lit up, not with flame, but with faces. Faces of the choir children, peering out from the chapel's scorched floorboards, mouths still open, still singing, and still burning. In the days that followed the failed ritual, time began to rot in Bell Hollow. Clocks spun backward, calendars bled their dates off the page. Night came hours too early, and when dawn arrived, it didn't bring light. Just a dull grey fog that hung heavy in the streets like the breath of something massive and unseen. The few residents who hadn't already fled began speaking of dreams that bled into waking life. Dreams of standing ankle-deep in ash, holding hands with children whose skin glowed like coals, whose mouths moved but made no sound. The schoolhouse was sealed shut, not by ordinance but by unseen force. No one could force the door, not even firemen with axes could break through. Inside, some claimed to still hear the faint melody of the hymn looped endlessly, sung by voices too shrill to be children and too hollow to be human. A group of men who tried to burn the building to the ground disappeared the next morning. All that was found were the burnt outlines of their boots in a perfect circle around the chapel ruins, and one ear, freshly severed, still twitching. The cemetery across the hollow began to shift. Headstones changed names, graves cracked and gaped open, not from the top but from underneath. Several townsfolk reported seeing what looked like small fingers reaching up through the soil before retreating when spotted. A child's coffin, meant to be buried in 1889, was found upright at the edge of the woods, as if spat out. Inside, the skeleton had no skull. Instead, it was filled with blackened church hymnals, their pages soaked in something viscous and red. Pastor Klein's body, buried just outside the chapel as per tradition, would not stay underground. Twice his grave was found reopened. The third time, the coffin was empty. A week later, a blind woman claimed she saw him standing at the river's edge wearing a choir robe, his mouth sewn shut with piano wire, and his hands blistered from holding something he refused to drop. When others came to investigate, they found nothing, but the water smelled of burning cedar, and the ground was warm where he'd stood. A few brave souls attempted to leave Bell Hollow, only to find the single road out twisted into a loop. No matter how long they drove, they returned to the same crossroads by the chapel, with their gas tanks mysteriously refilled, and their watches stopped at 11:44 p.m., the moment the fire had first erupted 20 years before. Whispers began to circulate that the fire never ended, that the town itself had been buried inside it, and what now existed was only a copy, a paper-thin echo still flickering in the flame's last breath. People avoided their mirrors. The air itself tasted of copper and old wax, and at night from the hills came the unmistakable sound of children singing, off-key, slow, as if underwater. The choir had not been silenced. It had only been relocated, and its new audience was the living. When Margaret Wren returned to Bell Hollow, she carried with her the thick, leather-bound journal of her grandfather, Jonas Wren, the organ builder who had crafted the chapel's pipe organ before the fire. She'd been living in Cincinnati since childhood, spared the events of 1884, and yet something, she would later call it a tugging in the spine, had drawn her back. What she found was a town that didn't breathe right. Locals whispered sideways, and doors didn't open from the outside. Every home kept salt on the windowsills and hymn verses scratched into the wood of the floorboards, and no one spoke of the schoolhouse. Margaret's journal entries, now preserved in a restricted collection at the State Archive, tell of her descent into the echo reality of Bell Hollow. Her grandfather's journal was more than just a builder's diary. It contained blueprints never used, notes scrawled in a shaking hand, and references to something he called the harmonic seal. Jonas had believed music could bind spirits, or worse, release them. He had been pressured by Klein and the church elders to tune the organ in a frequency not sanctioned by any hymnal, a deep guttural resonance they insisted had scriptural origins. Margaret's writings describe these notes as capable of stirring the marrow from the bone. She wandered the town at night, chasing the songs no one else would admit hearing. She claimed the air grew warmer when she drew near the chapel. One night, she found the door open, not broken, just quietly ajar. Inside, the pews were coated in dust, but no dust settled on the altar. The organ, long thought to be destroyed, stood intact, polished and freshly tuned. Its pipes hummed with pressure as though waiting. The benches bore impressions where unseen bodies had recently sat. Margaret opened the final page of her grandfather's journal at the pulpit. There was a map, crude, sketched in blood, and a message that read, "The 13th child must never speak." She looked up. In the mirror above the altar, she saw 12 small figures standing behind her, heads bowed, arms outstretched. Slowly they raised their fingers to their lips. Silence. Then a voice, deep and scraping. "You came back because the song never left you." She turned. No one was there. But the room had changed. Longer now, darker, the walls stretching like fabric under strain. The sound of the organ grew, without keys being touched. The hymn that played was the same that had ended the lives of the original choir. But now it was in reverse. A hymn meant not to sanctify, but to summon. Margaret fled, but not before she took a single pipe from the organ, still warm, still trembling. She hid it in her suitcase, and when she returned to Cincinnati, she left a note at the station. "Bell Hollow is not a town. It's a cathedral turned inside out. The choir is real, and they are looking for a 13th voice." No one ever saw Margaret Wren again, but several passengers on that train claimed to hear a child singing from the overhead luggage rack, a song they couldn't place, one they couldn't forget. It was Reverend Corman who first noticed the anomaly in the chapel's foundation. During a cold winter in early February 1905, months after Margaret Wren vanished, he had returned to Bell Hollow to investigate the rumors of sung apparitions reported by freight workers and lantern boys crossing near the ruins. The congregation had long since dissolved. The rebuilt church stood unused, but untouched by time, as if something had kept it preserved. When Corman lifted a section of the rotten floorboards near the altar, he discovered a sealed trapdoor made of ironwood, no nails, just fused planks. He grained scorched black and inscribed with sigils older than the Baptist faith itself. He recorded the event in a letter to the Appalachian Ecclesiastical Review, though it was never published. He described finding scratch marks along the underside of the trapdoor, marks that began from within. The edges were clawed by hands or tools desperate to escape, but never succeeded. He also described an odor that lingered for days after, not of rot, but of burning parchment and children's breath. No one would assist him when he asked the town elders to help open the passage. They warned him quietly and without emotion that the choir must stay beneath, or the fire returns. Despite their resistance, Corman returned with a crowbar and a lantern. What he found below the floorboards wasn't just a crypt. It was a hall, a narrow corridor carved through limestone and pitch, sloping downward at an impossible angle. The further he descended, the fainter his lantern's glow became. Not dimmer, but paler, as if the flame were being turned to silence. The walls were covered in handprints, too small to be adult, and too many to count. They covered the path like a second skin. Then the singing began. Faint, high, layered, 12 voices in harmony. Corman called out to them but received no answer. He later wrote that it was not an echo, but a rehearsal. The song they practiced had no melody, only sustained tones in unnatural intervals, discordant yet perfectly timed. He described it as music meant for something not born in this world, something waiting for its name to be sung correctly. Midway through the descent, it was Reverend Corman who first noticed the anomaly in the chapel's foundation. During a cold winter in early February 1905, months after Margaret Wren vanished, he had returned to Bell Hollow to investigate the rumors of sung apparitions reported by freight workers and lantern boys crossing near the ruins. The congregation had long since dissolved. The rebuilt church stood unused but untouched by time, as if something had kept it preserved. When Corman lifted a section of the rotten floorboards near the altar, he discovered a sealed trapdoor made of ironwood, no nails, just fused planks, the grain scorched black and inscribed with sigils older than the Baptist faith itself. He recorded the event in a letter to the Appalachian Ecclesiastical Review, though it was never published. He described finding scratch marks along the underside of the trapdoor, marks that began from within. The edges were clawed by hands or tools, desperate to escape but never succeeded. He also described an odor that lingered for days after, not of rot, but of burning parchment and children's breath. No one would assist him when he asked the town elders to help open the passage. They warned him, quietly and without emotion, that the choir must stay beneath, or the fire returns. Despite their resistance, Corman returned with a crowbar and a lantern. What he found below the floorboards wasn't just a crypt. It was a hall, a narrow corridor carved through limestone and pitch, sloping downward at an impossible angle. The further he descended, the fainter his lantern's glow became. Not dimmer, but paler, as if the flame were being turned to silence. The walls were covered in handprints, too small to be adult and too many to count. They covered the path like a second skin. Then the singing began. Faint, high, layered, 12 voices in harmony. Corman called out to them but received no answer. He wrote that it was not an echo, but a rehearsal. The song they practiced had no melody, only sustained tones in unnatural intervals, discordant yet perfectly timed. He described it as music meant for something not born in this world, something waiting for its name to be sung correctly. Midway through the descent, he reached a door with no handle. Above it the words, "He who listens must join." He did not pass through, or so he said. What happened next remains debated. Corman returned to the surface pale and trembling. He boarded a train bound for Charleston and vanished before reaching his destination. His lantern, journal, and the organ pipe Margaret had stolen were found in a duffel bag abandoned on the platform. The train conductor reported seeing a man walk off into the woods just as the whistle blew, humming a tune that didn't match any known hymn. Later that week, the Bell Hollow Chapel burned again. But this time, no flames were seen, only smoke, thick and white, pouring from the cracks in the foundation. The building stood unscathed, but the interior had changed. Every surface was covered in ash, and the organ played, though the keys had been removed. 12 pews had fresh indentations in them, and a 13th, new, freshly installed, waited at the center as if saved for someone who had not yet arrived. In the weeks that followed Reverend Corman's disappearance and the chapel's inexplicable smoke event, a tension settled across Bell Hollow like the stillness before a second storm. Families began reporting strange incidents, doors found open despite having been locked, children waking from night terrors with soot on their feet, and in one household, an entire Bible. Sheriff Abram Fitch was the only authority left willing to investigate. He had grown up in Bell Hollow and had always dismissed the Wren fire as an unfortunate accident compounded by hysteria, but even Fitch couldn't explain what he found in the basement of the town's records hall. Boxes of census documents for families that no one remembered, all of them bearing the surname Wren, dating back to 1831. 17 children, 5 adults, all with identical handwriting on birth records, all listed as musically gifted, yet no school records, no grave markers, no witnesses. When he showed the documents to the town clerk, the man stared in silence, then simply said, "That family was never meant to be counted." Late one night, Fitch returned to the chapel. He entered alone, though he told his deputy he'd be back by dawn. He never came back. What his deputy did find, however, became the most whispered about artifact in Bell Hollow's oral tradition. On the altar, right where the trapdoor had been discovered, sat a phonograph. It had not been seen in the town before and appeared new, though the make was decades old. No electricity, no crank, yet it played. The deputy didn't touch it, only listened, and what it played, he would later describe in his final letter to his cousin in Indiana, was a song without words, a harmony without structure. He wrote, "It felt like listening to children who never learned to breathe, like their lungs were still singing in the dark, waiting to be heard." After that night, he resigned, left Bell Hollow, and was found months later in a state asylum outside Columbus, Ohio, blindfolded and humming to himself, always in a group of 12 notes, never deviating. The town elders finally acted. On March the 3rd, 1905, they sealed the chapel completely. They replaced its windows with concrete, burned the pews, and filled the entire foundation with limestone, and salt. A new sign was nailed to the front door: "Do not re-enter. Voices do not rest." No one has officially entered since, but hikers passing through the hollow still report one recurring phenomenon. Every year, on the same week in March, if you stand close enough to the earth where the chapel once stood, you can feel a pulse in the ground, not a tremor, a rhythm. 12 beats, always 12. And sometimes, if you're very still, you'll hear a 13th beat. Not in harmony, not joining, waiting. The pulse beneath the chapel wasn't the only thing that lingered. Over the following decades, Bell Hollow became a place spoken of only in cautionary tones, whispered about in letters, avoided on maps, and shunned by county planners. Trains were rerouted, roads were forgotten, and by 1920 the town was, for all official purposes, erased. But it wasn't empty. Those who dared to return, researchers, journalists, and the occasional thrill seeker, reported consistent phenomena that grew eerily specific. An overwhelming scent of scorched wood, despite no fire damage, trails of ash forming perfect circles, and once, a camera found recording itself with no operator pointed toward the horizon where the chapel once stood. But perhaps the most disturbing encounter came from a woman named Evelyn Miara, a musicologist from New York. In 1948, she ventured to the ruins under the pretense of studying Appalachian folk harmonics, but privately, she was searching for what her grandfather, a conductor in the 1903 Bell Hollow revival, had referred to in his diary as the dissonant key. Evelyn stayed 3 nights in a preserved cabin on the edge of the old grounds. On the third night, she made a recording using a wax cylinder device. What she captured remains one of the most contested audio artifacts in paranormal history. Initially, it was dismissed as degraded noise, scratches, reverberations, faint background hums. But when the file was later digitized and slowed, a haunting truth emerged. The audio revealed 12 overlapping voices, but they didn't speak. They sighed, repeating the same measure again and again in minor intervals. The uncanny part was their placement in stereo space, each voice coming from a different direction as if positioned in a circle around the listener, and beneath them, imperceptible unless one increased the gain to unnatural levels, a 13th sound, a cough or a breath or something clawing to be let in. Evelyn disappeared shortly after submitting her findings to the Institute for Sacred Harmonics in Baltimore. Her notes were found torn and stained, but one final line remained legible. The key is not music. The key is restraint. They only sang because they were told not to. No body was ever recovered. Her car was found with the door ajar and the ignition cold. On the passenger seat, a small bell, cracked clean down the center with ash beneath it, though no fire had been reported in the area for decades. By then, the legend had metastasized. Locals began referring to Bell Hollow as the place with too many ears. They claimed that if you said the number 12 aloud on the chapel grounds, something would listen, and if you said 13, something would answer. Whatever had ignited the fire in 1904 had not gone. It had waited, patiently, rhythmically, beneath the stone and ash, not for worship, but for return. In 1957, a classified file was quietly opened under the Office of Cultural Defense, part of a Cold War initiative to track unexplainable auditory phenomena across the United States. One redacted entry stood out: Appalachian Cluster, Bell Hollow, WV. Though most of the contents remain sealed, the summary notes referenced post-traumatic harmonics, pre-fall resonance patterns, and a curious phrase: the choir returns every 50 years, -1. What could that mean? The answer didn't reveal itself until 1972, when, without warning, the entire area experienced what witnesses described as a silent quake. No tremors were recorded on seismographs, yet fences fell inward, weather vanes spun counterclockwise, and glass shattered in neat concentric patterns. No one heard it, but everyone felt it. Then came the letters, nearly identical postcards sent to historical societies, college choirs, and obscure music schools across the U.S., all postmarked from Charleston, West Virginia, all unsigned. Each card contained the same single sentence: the dissonance begins where the hymn ends. Some ignored it. Others grew obsessed, comparing it to suppressed hymnals lost in the mid-19th century. But a few, mostly those with family roots near Bell Hollow, began to dream. Vivid, cohesive dreams of a scorched congregation. Not screaming, not praying, just humming in unbearable unison. One man, Professor Daniel Clive of Georgetown University, abandoned his post after receiving the card. In his apartment, investigators found pages of notes written in reversed cursive, musical notations drawn in blood, and a phrase carved repeatedly into his desk: "They never sang to God." Weeks later, his body was found at the base of the Bell Hollow Foundation, hands fused over his mouth, eyes wide open and burned black, though again there had been no fire. The nearby community of Harrow's Edge, now the closest living town to Bell Hollow, began reporting what they called mirror echoes. Residents would speak a word, and moments later hear it whispered, not from a person, but from the direction of the woods. The phenomenon intensified near the anniversary of the fire. On October 14th, a group of teens dared each other to sing an old Baptist hymn near the ruins. They recorded the moment on a reel-to-reel. When played back, the hymn was still there, but layered under it were voices they hadn't heard in the moment. 12 distorted harmonies rising in minor key. Then a pause, and a 13th voice, deeper, speaking one word: louder. After that, no one dared approach again. But the bell tower, long since crumbled, was reportedly seen, by 3 separate eyewitnesses, reconstructed in full beneath a lightning storm one night, and gone by morning. The silence that followed was never empty. It pulsed like breath through trees. It coiled beneath foundations. It sang, quietly, darkly, waiting for someone, somewhere, to sing back. In 1983, a private research group known as the Catafalque Institute published a limited circulation paper entitled Residual Acoustics and Non-Harmonic Echo Chambers in Appalachian Collapse Sites. It referenced over a dozen choral anomalies between 1870 and 1925, but one case, the Bell Hollow Fire, was blacked out in the printed version, with only the phrase "Inverted Revival 1904" left exposed. Despite legal threats, an internal leak provided audio tapes from their investigation, real recordings captured during an unauthorized night vigil at the site. Most of the tape was silent until timestamp 03:17:43. Then came a sound, neither fully voice nor instrument. It was layered, metallic, and wet, like a pipe organ underwater, filtered through ash. The team who recorded it never returned. Months later, one of tin. Their vehicles was found submerged in an abandoned cistern 12 miles from the church ruins. In the trunk were two items, a charred hymnal bound shut with iron wire and a melted wax cylinder labeled Response 3 in D minor. The institute disbanded that year. By 1991, local authorities, tired of the whispered legends, erected a fence around the overgrown site and banned entry. But trespassers still came. The curious, the grieving, the desperate, and some, perhaps, who already heard something calling. That autumn, a well-known Appalachian musician named June Rawlins vanished while attempting to record a folk album at the site. Her final track, retrieved from her equipment, was titled Verse for the Ones Who Stayed. No vocals were recorded, but faintly on the far edge of the soundbed were breaths, not human ones, syncopated, rhythmically layered, as though responding to a beat she never played. Some say the choir was never 12, some believe it was always 13, mirroring the number of pews, the cracked rafters, the scorched Bibles found arranged like ribs in a thoracic cavity. Others claim there never was a choir at all, only echoes of a ritual misremembered as worship, because what looks like prayer, in the right light, might be something else entirely. What haunts Bell Hollow isn't a ghost story, it's a misalignment in harmony, an unresolved note held too long, a key sung too deep, and in that dissonance, something slipped. The last known sighting of anyone at Bell Hollow before the land was condemned came in 2006, when a forensic linguist named Dr. Myra Feldman arrived unannounced at the Charleston Historical Society. She had no luggage, no ID, and no recollection of the past 6 months. What she did have were two things: a rusted handbell fused to a clump of what appeared to be human tooth enamel, and a notebook filled with notations in a dead liturgical dialect, not spoken since the early 1800s. She claimed she'd been translating the echoes, a phrase that would puzzle analysts for years to come. The notebook's final entry was cryptic, just a single phrase repeated 12 times, each time with a different musical key beside it. The voices do not rise, they descend. No one has been able to explain the anomalous behaviors recorded on that land. Electronics malfunction within minutes, GPS coordinates become corrupted, audio devices either capture nothing at all or fill with static that pulses like a heartbeat, and those who ventured deepest into the ruin have described time behaving strangely, watches slowing, words repeating, and thoughts not entirely their own. In 2011, a documentary team attempted to produce a short film on the mystery of Bell Hollow. Only the director returned. Her footage, locked away by a streaming service after one private screening, allegedly showed a frame-by-frame reconstruction of the original choir's final moments, except none of it had been staged. The director claimed she never filmed it, that no actors were hired, and that the footage included details never made public, including the exact number of bodies and the hymn last performed before the fire. To this day, whispers circulate among certain musicologists and ritual historians about what really occurred that winter night in 1904. Some argue it was a mass possession, others a spontaneous occult ritual disguised as a Baptist gathering, but a growing number believe something far darker, that Bell Hollow was the final stop in a sequence of churches across the Appalachian region, each one unknowingly participating in a larger composition. A song written not by any human hand, but but by something else, something that required voices, willing or not. The ruins are silent now, at least to most, but for those who listen closely, who walk among the charred foundations with their heads tilted just slightly toward the ground, they say you can hear breath, a collective inhale, waiting, like a choir just before the first note. Because what was summoned that night wasn't finished. It was rehearsing, preparing, and the bell that melted in the fire. Some say it was only the first. There are others hidden beneath other towns waiting to ring once more. What no one has explained is the appearance of a new cornerstone at the edge of the ruins. It wasn't there before. A single slab of blackened marble, inscribed only with a date, December 19th, 2025. No name, no message, just a date, carved so deep it cracked the stone. Those who've investigated further claim the slab hums at night. Not randomly, not as wind or temperature would explain, but in rhythm, as if something beneath the soil is breathing again, and waiting for that date to rise. There's growing belief among occult scholars that Bell Hollow was not a closed event, but an overture, the first note of something much longer, something orchestrated. According to a classified letter recovered from a defunct sect of the Southern Conference of Baptist Congregations, the original choir director, Samuel Gray, never died in the fire. His body was never recovered. Some believe he lived on, preaching in smaller, hidden churches without names, carrying a new gospel written in a language no longer human. A gospel made entirely of sound. Whether or not the voices that sang after the fire were truly from the children or from something that had taken them remains uncertain. But the pattern is becoming clearer. Music as invocation, harmony as conduit, melody as gate. The bell, the hymn, the choir, they were not tragedy. They were technology, and we misunderstood what they opened. You may think this story ends in 1904 with fire and ash, but listen closely. If you hear a sound in the night, soft, layered, distant, like a lullaby carried on smoke, it may not be in your head. It may be your invitation, because the choir that sang after the fire, they were only warming up.